The Steam Deck is unlike any... Nah. Alright. The Steam Deck is a super interesting device. I think I need to give a little context here before we get into this. Alright, so when it comes to gaming, there's always been a plethora of options to play your games on. But if you take a step back and break it down, you can essentially split them up into three groups. First, you have your traditional home consoles. This is perhaps your most mainstream option out there. They are easy to use and accessible. You buy a console, buy a game, hook it up to a screen, and you're ready to go. But it comes with the downside that with each console release, there's often a drastic shift in architecture or form factor, meaning there's no guarantee that the games you own on your current system will work on the new hardware. Not to mention, you're only limited to using the services the console manufacturer provides, whether it's good or not. You don't really have a choice here. Next, you have handhelds. When you think about it, handhelds are essentially just home consoles, but smaller. You still have your dedicated shops, its own online services, and its very own library of games. So, the best part of a handheld is no doubt the ability to play it wherever you want. But they've always been less capable than their contemporary home counterparts. And because of that, games on handhelds are often designed with a lower budget and scope in mind. Rarely will you see an original AAA game developed exclusively for a handheld in the same scale or budget as something you'll see on a home console. Last but not least, you have PC. Here you can have pretty much unlimited combinations with all kinds of specs. This is also where you'll find the biggest library of games spanning across multiple generations, and the freedom to customize exactly how you want to play. Game preservation is also not really a problem here, where if you own a game on PC, it will most likely also work on your next PC. So yes, having the freedom is great, but the amount of options can also be quite overwhelming for less tech-savvy people out there, when all they want to do is pick up a controller and start playing. So with the release of the Switch then, you get the benefits of playing high-quality AAA games from a traditional console, and the ability to play all of that wherever you want, like a handheld. Which most of you probably know by now paid off tremendously well for Nintendo, with the Switch now already being the second best-selling handheld of all time, just below the original DS. But it is still a traditional console at heart. So unless Nintendo chooses to bring over legacy titles or design future hardware with this in mind, all your purchases will forever be stuck on the Switch. So when you combine the lower entry barrier and the ability to play on the big screen like a home console, the portability of a handheld, with the freedom and the massive back catalog of a PC, you get the Steam Deck. But first, we need to talk about UMPC. UMPC, Ultra Mobile Personal Computers, handheld computers that were designed to run software built for desktop PCs. That sounds awesome, so why is this only a thing now? The truth is, they've actually always been around, but with limited technologies back then, they've only really been powerful enough for checking emails or basic word processing. Fast forward to today, we now have sleek and tiny handhelds that can play more than AAA games. But the downside of that is these handhelds are often super expensive, going upwards of $1,000. On top of that, with limited customer supports and sometimes not so great build quality despite the high price, they've remained a niche hobby for handheld enthusiasts like me. In that sense, the Steam Deck is a super interesting device because, while not the first to do something like this, I'd argue it's the first one to get the most right, while doing this at a super competitive price. With that said, join me as we take a deep dive with the Steam Deck. We'll look at the hardware in detail, look at some games in emulation, and we'll go through everything good and maybe not so good about the handheld after owning it for 9 months, and ultimately see if it's really worth your money. But before we jump in, I just want to give a heads up and mention that due to some personal preferences, I've opted to use Windows on my Steam Deck here. But the performance between the two is largely the same. While I'll still be touching on the experience with SteamOS, any negative software experience with Windows will not be factored into my review. With that out of the way, hello and welcome to my review of the Steam Deck. Besides Nintendo, Sony and Microsoft, when you think about it, Valve getting into the hardware business makes a lot of sense. Compared to the likes of Google and Amazon, not only does Valve have years of experience in the gaming landscape, they've also dabbled in the hardware business themselves. With the knowledge Valve has accumulated over the years with products like the Steam controller and the Vive headset, the Steam Deck definitely feels like a premium product. So when you take a look at the Steam Deck itself, the first thing that should jump out the most is probably the size. When I first learned that the Steam Deck was going to be bigger than the Wii U gamepad, I was kinda skeptical. But now that I've used it, I think the size is what makes the Steam Deck so good. And that is saying a lot coming from someone like me. As people who watch my older stuff would know, I have a pretty unhealthy obsession with smaller handhelds. So yes, it is less compact than a traditional handheld, but right out of the box, the deck only offers handheld mode as an option. So Valve has got to make sure it feels great to use, and I think they've done a pretty good job in this aspect. One benefit with the Steam Deck for being so big then means Valve can move all the parts that would usually heat up during gameplay away from your hands. So even if it does get hot, you wouldn't really feel it. And it never gets too loud under load as well. I'd say it's comparable to the Switch, maybe even a little quieter. So for something this big, must be pretty heavy, right? Well, on paper, the deck is heavier than the Switch. But because the size difference of the two are way more pronounced than the weight difference, in practice, the deck doesn't really feel that much heavier than the Switch. And if we take a look at another UMPC on the market right now, the GP2 Win 3, yeah, this thing looks pretty compact on the surface, but it's actually way heavier than it looks. Where, in my opinion, the deck, while appearing big in size, feels lighter than it looks. The button placements, from the touchpad to the grips, just fit perfectly onto my hand when I pick it up. I never find myself feeling uncomfortable reaching for anything. I'm usually a fan of clicky buttons like on the Switch Joy-Con than mushy ones found on the Switch Lite. But they're built so solid here on the deck, I might even say they feel better than ones you get from some full-size controllers. As for the touchpad, unlike the Steam controller which had a round and concave surface, the ones on the deck are flat and smooth. They also come with haptics and vibrate when you move your finger along the surface, which could be pretty handy for games that utilize mouse control. Plus, you have the ability to use as camera control as well. The Steam Deck also comes included with gyro, but unlike a traditional console where game devs have to implement gyro into their games for it to work, the Steam Deck has the option for you to map the gyro to a mouse or an analog stick in any games you want, meaning every game will support gyro. Unlike the Switch, the Steam Deck uses analog triggers. Yes, the deck might not be the first one to implement analog triggers into a handheld, but I'd argue it's probably the best implementation I've seen so far. With a smooth and deep travel, and the concave nature of them just feels great in your hand. Besides the shoulder buttons, the deck also comes with two sets of back buttons, which again function as extra hotkeys for more complicated PC games that might require them. And these analog sticks to me feel better than some you get on actual controllers, let alone handhelds. Granted, they aren't Hall sensors, so eventually it might start drifting like Switch, but you also have to keep in mind that Valve has been doing an amazing job on user repairability and customer support, and they generally feel more well built than the sticks on the Switch Joy-Con. When it comes to the display then, Valve went with an 800p LCD panel, which is the same as 720p but for 16:10. The taller aspect ratio compared to 16:9 means older games that uses a 4:3 aspect ratio scale a lot nicer on the display. As for the resolution, some might say it should have been a 1080p or heck even 4K. But personally, I think a 720p or 800p screen is still the perfect resolution for handheld gaming. Having to stretch a 720p image or using dynamic upscaling will never look anywhere as good as an 800p image running natively on an 800p panel. Not to mention the battery hit you'll be getting with a 1080p panel. Perhaps Valve could have gone with an OLED, but to keep the cost down, I think they made the right move going with an LCD. In terms of the audio, you have the options to use headphones with the standard 3.5 audio jack, Bluetooth audio, or the built-in stereo speakers, which I think should be the most common use case for a lot of us. The speakers, while not very heavy in bass, they are loud enough and still a step up from the Nintendo Switch. And with the two speakers placed quite a bit away from each other thanks to the size of the Steam Deck, you can actually get some pretty good stereo effects in some games. Along the top of the system is where you'll find your power and your volume control, your standard 3.5 audio port, and your exhaust fan, which are spaced out evenly in a symmetrical manner, which I very much appreciate the attention to details here. Here is also where you'll find your single USB port, which functions as your charging port, and video out. Along the bottom of the device, there's a slot for microSD card and nothing else. It would have been nice if there's a second USB port on the bottom, but I understand that any additional thing Valve adds to the deck is going to drive the cost up, which brings us into the price. There's been a lot of debates on whether the Steam Deck is just too expensive compared to the Switch. Yes, on the surface, the Steam Deck does cost quite a bit more than the Switch, but once you actually break it down, the value of the deck will start to make a whole lot more sense. Alright, so let's say if you were to get the regular Switch, not the OLED, for £250 and put it up against the base Steam Deck for £350. You're looking at £100 difference here. But when you're getting a console, you're never just getting the console by itself. While you're losing the ability to dock the Steam Deck right out of the box, it makes up for it with other aspects that the Switch is not doing. Like the ability to back up your saves locally or to the cloud and play online for free, which is £60 a year on the Switch. In terms of games, a lot of first-party and sometimes even third-party games on the Switch rarely go on sale, not to mention they will most likely run better on the deck than with the now dated 2015 chipset on the Switch. So how do the games run on the deck? The performance on the Steam Deck is so good sometimes it feels more like streaming to me, but they are in fact running natively on the hardware. Yeah, more often than not, you'll have to turn the settings to low or maybe run the games at 30 FPS. But that's the thing, most games will run on the deck at a stable frame rate if you're willing to sacrifice some image quality. It might not sound all that impressive at first, but if you take a look at the Switch, where so many games can barely hit 720p at 30 FPS, the deck suddenly becomes a lot more appealing. While the deck can run pretty much all kinds of PC games, old and new, I think it shines the most with games from the past couple of years, stuff that uses more modern engines. Now everything under the Great on Deck section is pretty much guaranteed to work. And Steam Deck support for new releases has been growing quite steadily as well, but there are some notable omissions here. You won't find Minecraft, Fortnite, or pretty much anything that isn't on Steam. That also means for people looking into using the Steam Deck for Xbox Game Pass, your best option is probably to dual boot into Windows, but I understand it might not be easy for an average user out there. For older games that uses OpenGL or DirectX 9, like GTA 4 is infamous for being an unoptimized PC port, but under SteamOS running under Proton, which is a Windows translation layer for Linux. These games now work so well, and I find the deck perfect for these kind of older titles, since they don't take up much space at all as opposed to games coming out nowadays which can easily go over 100 gig. Most of the time, however, I find myself gravitating towards more arcadey stuff or racing games like Grid or Forza, which suits the Steam Deck's pick up and play nature. While I'm not personally into RPGs, I can still see the Steam Deck being the perfect device to do your level grinding stuff, which brings us into the sleep mode. Some games like Forza or Final Fantasy 15, they can take quite a bit of time to get into the game. But with the game open, I sometimes just put the deck into sleep mode instead of turning it off, which sounds like a pretty basic feature on the surface, especially if you are coming from the Switch. But with the way a PC works, this is not often the case. And thanks to that, I've completed a lot more games than ever before since it fits into my lifestyle a lot better. The lowest end model Valve offers only has a 64 gig internal storage, with a portion of that taken up by the system and Proton wrappers that come with most games you download, and those can come in at about 1 or 2 gig each. That doesn't really leave you much room for games. Not to mention PC games are so big these days, if you are getting the 64 gig model, you would definitely need an SD card to go with it. And I might actually suggest you give Windows a shot, since you might save some room without having to download any Proton wrappers. But if you don't want to jump through the hoops in doing so, a micro SD card should still do just fine. But even on the highest end, Valve only offers a 512 gig model, as I've always had a habit of upgrading my Windows handheld to 2TB. But since the deck uses a slightly unconventional 2230 SSD instead of the more standard 2280 used in other handhelds, even for 1TB, it's just way too expensive for me to justify. So if you have the technical know-how to upgrade the SSD yourself, I suggest getting the 64 gig model. However, the limited storage actually changed my gaming habit for the better. I used to have all my games installed locally on my previous handhelds, but that meant most of the time I had trouble picking out what to play, and I just end up not playing much of anything at all. But with the lower storage on the deck, I only have about 5 or 6 games installed at any given time. And because of that, I've finished way more games than I ever did before. Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal are games I've always wanted to finish, but never really got into it playing it at my desk or TV. So I got the Switch port when that came out. While impressive in its own right, the cutbacks made it much less satisfying. On the Steam Deck, however, I managed to beat both of them back to back at 60 FPS, and I can finally cross them out on my backlog. Now, while this isn't Valve's main selling point or intention, outside of PC games, the Steam Deck is also a pretty good emulation machine. Most of the more mature emulators will work pretty decently on the deck, which means, yes, you can play Nintendo Switch on your Steam Deck. With the Switch and the deck both out on the market right now, with the price not even that far from each other, it's just crazy to me that you can fully emulate one on another, sometimes with even better experience than the original hardware. Now obviously, emulating the Switch on your Steam Deck is still kinda on the novelty side if you ask me, since you'll get a much better battery playing on the native hardware than emulating it. But from a technological standpoint, it is still really impressive. With Dolphin, I find hit or miss unfortunately, which is a shame since it actually runs better on my previous handhelds. Some lower end games will run perfectly fine, but I ran into some performance issue with Mario Galaxy, which by raising the GPU clocks and TDP didn't really help much. But apparently, if you're on Linux, this is something you can fix, where disabling SMT with power tools will get rid of the performance issue with Dolphins. But I've also heard it comes with its own set of issues, so take it with a grain of salt. However, I do believe this is a software issue rather than a hardware limitation, and will eventually get ironed out. But if you are looking to get a Steam Deck for Dolphin, I would not recommend you to do that right now. PS2 emulation with PCSX2 has actually been a pleasant surprise for me, since I've always had problems with it. I thought the raw horsepower of the deck was what finally made it work, but turns out the PCSX2 team has done so much optimizing to the emulator that even on my weaker handhelds, it still runs some heavier games pretty well. So while the heaviest games like Gran Turismo 4 might not run particularly well, games like Burnout Revenge actually runs perfectly fine now at 2x internal resolution. With the Steam Deck being quite CPU limited, most PS3 games still won't run particularly great here with UMPCs 3. But if you really want to, you can still run Demon's Souls at a pretty stable 30 FPS here. And now with Persona 5 out on PC, there's no point emulating that on here now. The emulator is way better than what it was a couple years ago, but I still think it has a long way to go. Okay, so that's cool and all, but none of that really matters if the battery on the Steam Deck isn't good. So how does that fare? In current or last gen titles running at a locked 30 FPS, you'll be looking at about 9 watts, which is about 3 to 4 hours from a single charge. This is when running the game at the native 800p with no upscaling enabled. A couple of titles can reach 40 or even 60 FPS, but you'll need to bump up the TDP to about 15 watts, which equates to about 90 minutes of playtime, which is pretty bad. For some older stuff that comfortably hit 60 FPS, I've actually been playing a couple of those in 40 FPS, and it's been such a game changer to me. While running a 40 FPS game on a 60Hz panel causes inconsistent frame pacing, 40 FPS with a 40Hz refresh rate feels significantly better than 30 FPS with a 60Hz refresh, with way less impact to the battery than running it in full 60 FPS. It makes so much sense on a handheld that I won't even be surprised if Nintendo Switch 2 will support 40Hz. On SteamOS, Valve lets each individual title have their own performance profile, where you can set the refresh rate and TDP, which is pretty neat. But from a console user standpoint, which might not want to care about these things, they could perhaps implement something where other Steam Deck users can submit power profiles, and the highest rated one will be automatically applied on initial run. Sort of like what they're already doing with community controller profiles, just to make the jump from console to PC even more seamless for casual players. In terms of battery with emulations, I find myself leaning towards some of the lower end stuff like PSP, where I can get a longer playtime from a single charge. For PSP games, I lock my TDP to about 5 watts, which will get me about 6 to 7 hours of playtime. But here's the cool thing, I found some of the Wii U games out there, I can also lock the TDP to about 5 watts. So with some games like New Super Mario Bros. U or Pikmin 3, I can actually get longer playtime on the deck compared to the Wii U ports on Switch. Since Valve is really marketing the Steam Deck as a AAA game machine, it is a little disappointing that the battery of those games is the one thing that falls short. While it isn't really a big deal for me personally since I mostly use the Steam Deck at home anyways, to some of you it might be a pretty big deal breaker, but I do miss the time where we aim for at least 10 hours with our DS and Game Boys, and it's pretty funny looking back at the 4 hours playtime on the PSP was considered unacceptable. So, all things considered, what do I think of the Steam Deck overall then? Sure, it has its flaws, but for a handheld with this kind of performance and still being sold at this price point, I just can't stress enough how much value you're getting with the Steam Deck. If you were to compare the Steam Deck to any UMPCs in the markets right now, there's simply no competition. Since Valve is selling the deck at a loss in hopes to make a return with software sales, so not only do you get what you pay for, I think you actually get more than what you pay for, which no other UMPCs manufacturers can do. Yes, those devices might be slightly faster or more compact than the Steam Deck, but the deck is still going to be the best bang for your buck by a wide margin. If you were to compare the Switch to the deck, however, it gets a little bit trickier. With the deck, you often get much better graphics and performance than the same game on the Switch, which often costs more than the Steam version. But on the Switch, you have stuff you simply can't get on the deck, things like Labo or Ring Fit, and a much better battery life while being far more compact. While some might see more value from the Steam Deck, some might prefer the Switch as it simply fits their lifestyle better. So all in all, I think these two handhelds offer fundamentally very different experiences, and they each offer something you can't get on the other one. While other UMPCs manufacturers are out there pumping out new handhelds left and right, I don't see Valve themselves releasing a revision with a major spec bump anytime soon, since they've only just managed to iron out their stock shortage problem with the current Steam Deck. And since they're already selling their deck at a loss right now, I personally don't see a price drop anytime soon. But if Valve is indeed looking into new hardware, however, instead of a next-gen deck, I would personally like to see something like what Nintendo's done with the Miracle revision of the Switch. The same performance, but more power efficient. A better screen like the OLED Switch, multiple color options, or maybe a smaller form factor like the Switch Lite. Maybe they could double down in the direction of the Switch and pack in a dock, a new Steam controller for dock mode, and maybe even start looking into selling retail units in stores instead of just ordering from Steam. While I don't think the Steam Deck will ever reach the heights of its popularity as opposed to something like the Switch, I think the impact it will have on not only the handheld space, but the PC gaming markets really cannot be understated. With the Steam Deck really being the first true mainstream option besides Nintendo's offering in the handheld space since the PS Vita in 2011, it's going to be pretty interesting to see how things go from here. And with that concludes my review of the Steam Deck. If you made it all the way to the end, I hope you had a good time watching this, as much as I had making it. Otherwise, thanks for watching.